Your favorite developer's favorite game. This kind of phraseology pops up a lot with popular media. Sometimes it has a charge to it. Author inspired by this dusty tome, but we're not sure how. Check out the tripe your favorite band listens to. Seminole director insists this avant-garde tour de force was essential inspiration for their crappy rom-com. Well, have you ever played Wizardry? This game came out for the Apple II in 1981, though it was popular enough that it garnered a number of ports. Many of these ports were Japan only, that's how much they loved it. If this doesn't look good to you, well, I probably wouldn't mention that if you ever meet your favorite developer. Wizardry, and Ultima, might own real estate in their heart. Enter Yuji Horii. It's no secret that his most famous and successful creation was originally meant to adapt the systems of Wizardry and Ultima. He and his team strove to create a vehicle by which a broader demographic of players could make it to the finish line. Even at the time, computer role-playing games were a bit too much to handle for many players. It would be difficult to call Dragon Quest anything other than a success in this regard, since the series has proven manageable for virtually all prospective players. Whether its unique charm can retain players of differing or numerous penchants is up to more complicated and nuanced factors.
のパピコン勉強します遊びます調べますパピコン
Yuji Horii is somewhat unique among his contemporaries in that he actually has a background in writing, graduating from Waseda University's Department of Literature in 1978. During that period, he had a number of works published in concert with his colleagues from the Waseda Manga Club, worked as a broadcast writer, and later in magazines. It was only after a real estate tabloid publisher that would later become known as Enix hosted a game programming contest that Horii decided to try his hand at game design. In 1983, his entirely self-developed Love Match Tennis became one of their winners. As much as I'd love to get into the intricacies of a tennis game script, what we'll be looking at are Horii's three main instances of narrative-driven works. That's his trilogy of graphic adventure games, Dragon Quest, and Chrono Trigger. You may only have extensively played one of these, and I think it's a pretty safe bet which one that is, but you may be surprised to know that the Portopia serial murder case is considered equally influential. This wasn't the first graphic adventure or anything. Games like Mystery House were already known to Japan by the time Horii's solo development on Portopia had begun. But early Japanese graphic adventures benefited from superior hardware and generally featured better colors for their time. In an interview with Automaton, Horii explained, "As an aspiring cartoonist, I dreamt of being able to tell a story through the computer." He remarked that Portopia has no descriptive text, and that the only way to absorb the world and progress is through dialogue with Yasu, the player character's assistant. He intimated that he learned this approach through working in manga, that such text is easier to read, and that this is the same mode of operation utilized in Dragon Quest. Most of the interaction in computer games of the time was through a combination of descriptive text and dialogue, he reflected. I don't think there was much personality in that. This is really what separates Dragon Quest from Final Fantasy, in that the narrative informs the gameplay to a much higher degree. Take Dragon Quest IV, for example, which famously breaks the game up into chapters that each present the player with new controllable characters. Or Dragon Quest V, which only really features one permanent protagonist with a rotating cast, many of which are monsters that can be captured and tamed at the player's discretion. But these are structural differences that wouldn't be lost in localization. An example of where localization did a genuine, objective disservice to the series is Dragon Warrior 7, where the Japanese game's party chat was omitted. This feature became an important staple, with nearly every mainline game and remake implementing it from that point forward. Many web pages claim that Horii took direct inspiration from Diablo in how players can talk with their friends while playing the game, but I couldn't find a quote to back this up. There was an interview conducted by Satoru Iwata for Nintendo's website where writer Sachiko Sugimura remarked, "In previous games, when using the talk command with nobody in front of you, it would just tell you there was nobody in that direction. That seemed a bit lonely, and I remember having conversations about changing that." Horii added, "You could talk to anyone before they'd become a member of your party, but as soon as they'd join up, no longer being able to talk to them was a little sad." Speaking again with Automaton, Horii recounted that, following his trilogy of adventure games and the Famicom port of Portopia, he expressed wanting to create a role-playing game next. At various points in this interview, he made statements like, "Creating an RPG gives you the freedom to do whatever you like. I wondered if I could make a suitable drama just with dialogue choices like yes and no. Drama is characterized by omission. And that's why his player characters don't speak. He told Gamasutra, you don't want to push words into the player's mouth. What I'm trying to avoid is a situation where the main character is saying something and you feel like, no, that's not something I want to be saying if I were there." Dragon Quest is known to be not nearly as popular anywhere as it is in Japan, and the collective effort trying to solve this mystery has been substantial. Some theories are better than others, and many of them probably have at least a grain of truth to them. Many players dislike silent protagonists. One theory states that localization is to blame. Dragon Warrior for the NES, for example, was rendered in Old English. In an interview with Polygon, Horii was asked, "Did you have a hand in that, or did you defer more to the localization team back then?" To which he replied, "In all honesty, I actually didn't know what they were doing at that time. My initial response was, why? And then, please stop." Executive producer Yu Miyake added, "Back in those days, Nintendo and NX were localizing the games essentially together, but we left it up to the discretion of Nintendo to handle that for us. It happened to not be so well received, unfortunately, after it was released. So thereafter, when we brought Dragon Quest VIII to the West, we reassessed the way we approached localization. It was important that the Japanese production and development teams took a larger part in the localization process to ensure that things were properly communicated." Observers can't quite agree as to whether Horii is extensively involved with or approves of his game's localizations as a whole. This interview seems to suggest that he and his team rubber-stamped the first game, probably had some brief conversations with Nintendo from Dragon Quest II to VII, then implemented stricter quality control thereafter. As to whether or not he liked what was done with Dragon Warriors 2, 3, 4, and 7, I would guess he's probably somewhat lukewarm on them. We don't know exactly whether the issue was one of accuracy or taste, but Horii's reaction to the English version of the first Dragon Quest suggests it's the latter, and that's what's more readily apparent anyway. Assuming Horii's understanding of English is only somewhat academic, it would take far more work to communicate individual discrepancies to him than it would merely to discuss topical issues like dialects. If Dragon Quest VIII really was the first to receive premium localization, whatever that may entail, it's easy to assert that this helped the series' worldwide appeal to grow, since it became the best received Dragon Quest outside of Japan up to that point in time. Then again, it was also the best received Dragon Quest inside of Japan, so it's possible that it was just a good game. Fans are divided as to whether or not Dragon Quest localization is part of the appeal or a detriment. Ever since Dragon Quest VIII, the series' new games and remakes alike have featured characters with exaggerated accents, at least in their English localizations. Some have tried to argue, Japan has regional accents and dialects of their own, and the localization is merely trying to adapt this sort of flavor. But the truth is that Dragon Quest has never featured a particularly detailed showcase of Japanese regional diversity. Sure, you might pick up on a bit of twang here and there, especially in more rural parts of the various Dragon Quest worlds, but it's not nearly as pronounced as it is in English. Many players enjoyed these changes. I'm going to be upfront and admit that I personally do not, but I'm also not here to uplift or criticize anyone's personal sense of aesthetics. I introduce these points to highlight something I believe has been overlooked. I don't think the added flair has particularly helped or hindered Dragon Quest. Rather, I believe the simple displacement of Yuji Horii's core scripts is the issue. You already know that Final Fantasy was the creation of one Hironobu Sakaguchi. He worked as director for the first 5 games and held various other positions through the next several games before handing off the series completely. Final Fantasy has had a number of different writers, and Sakaguchi was only directly responsible for parts of certain games' scenario and script writing, most prominently Final Fantasy IX. This is not the case with Dragon Quest, at least in the beginning. In addition to being the principal designer of virtually all Dragon Quest games, Horii was also the sole writer billed up front in Dragon Quests 1 through 6, though assistants are credited elsewhere. Comparing the Famicom port of the Portopia serial murder case with the first Dragon Quest, we see evidently how the transition from a graphic adventure to a role-playing game was not a huge leap. Commands like talk, take, search, and item are functionally similar or identical between the two games. In fact, Horii had already been preparing to expand the RPG aspects in future mystery games that never got made. Introducing more abstract text that indicates to the player what it is they acquired or accomplished without the intermediary Yasu-type character seems like something of a concession in light of what we know about Horii's approach, but understandable given that such a dynamic would not work given the structure of the story. In the first game especially, where you cannot recruit anyone to accompany the hero, the only other option would be for the protagonist to muse to themselves. Luckily, the castle and town of Raditome are rife with such lively folk that the player does not have time to feel lonely. I want to be as intellectually honest as possible and say that the Old English style present in Dragon Warrior doesn't exactly come out of nowhere. This is a seemingly medieval setting. There appears to be some sort of monarchy, the hero and guards are decked out with swords and armor, there are castles, and you are tasked with slaying a dragon. Moreover, the king of Raditome, who utters the opening lines of the game, and in fact most of the plot-relevant information in the entire script, speaks with a certain affectation. The truth is that these mannerisms are often used for older characters in general, and there are other old man characters in the game that talk this way. Look for sentences that end in ja. The rest of the townspeople speak in more or less standard Japanese. This was a good move. If Horii was trying to make sure the greatest number of players could digest Dragon Quest, it doesn't make sense to overcomplicate not just the gameplay but the language. In the April 2018 issue of Storybox, Horii spoke about how the world has changed, leaving little time for people like himself to sit back and spend time with games. He said he had allowed his games to become more favorably balanced toward the player, so that they would more assuredly progress smoothly. However, what has remained constant is the ease of understanding. I leave the commands in hiragana and take care not to leave anyone behind. So, rather than employing cryptic gameplay or misleading guidance, Horii relies on narrative subversion. I'm constantly going for the element of surprise, he told Den Famicom Gamer. Sometimes these twists happen near the beginnings of his games. Every so often they're at the end. At times they're all over the place. And perhaps most importantly, you're occasionally left wondering if there ever will be one at all. Which ones are which is something I wouldn't want to spoil for players who have yet to make a deep dive into Dragon Quest. (1992 to 95), arguably the greatest period in video game history. From 1986 to 1990, Horii and Enix were averaging nearly a Dragon Quest per year, but steadily increasing ambitions were leading to protracted development cycles, and it would take nearly 3 years for Dragon Quest V to be released, in Japan at least. It would take roughly another 3 before players would see 6, but there was another project commanding Horii's attention during that time. Chrono Trigger is famous for its association with the Dream Team, Yuji Horii, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and Akira Toriyama. Specifically, Sakaguchi worked on the gameplay, while Horii was part of the scenario writing team, though both are credited principally as supervisors. In the credits of Chrono Trigger, Masato Kato is listed under Story Plan, while nobody else is exactly included under any sort of writing heading. And yet, a cursory glance at the Wikipedia entry for Chrono Trigger proves confusing. The lead paragraph claims that Masato Kato wrote most of the story, while the info box lists 4 writers. The development section goes on to claim that Horii was involved with what was basically story plan, with Kato fleshing out his outline. Yoshinori Kitase and Takashi Tokita are cited as writing various subplots. This makes for a fair amount of confusion when you stop to think, if Masato Kato wrote most of the story, are subplots being considered part of that story? What even qualifies as a subplot in Chrono Trigger? Let's look at one of the interviews being used as a source for the most of the story statement. In a November 1999 interview with Yasunori Mitsuda's production company Procyon Studio, Kato recalls, Yuji Horii wrote the basic plot line first. Following that, it was edited and rewritten by me, and even further on after that, the sub-scenarios were created by Mr. Tokita and Mr. Kitase. So it all kind of gets mixed up in the end. But the 12,000 BC part was 100% my original idea. After writing the story for this part, I also did the events for Zeal Palace, the dungeons, and everything else by myself. Further on down, he adds, I also recall that when it came time to make the staff roll, they thought about placing the most important people on the top and just giving the title of the scenario writer to the top people of the planning division. I personally didn't give a hoot about any titles or that sort of stuff, so I just told them, do whatever you like. But then, Mr. Tokita and Mr. Kitase protested, and in the end, I remember I was given the rather unusual title of Story Planner. In one of the pre-release V-Jump interviews, Horii introduced himself by saying, I have the privilege of being in charge of the plot. He claimed in an interview included in Chrono Trigger The Perfect, I'm only involved with the plot. If there's a fairground, I just write that there's a fairground. I don't write down any of the details. Then the staff brainstorm and come up with a variety of attractions to put in. So it would seem Horii and Kato are in agreement that Horii was responsible for the outline, even though most of the time they're literally using the word plot as a loan word. In what Shmuplation's term collected 1995 magazine interviews from Famicom Tsushin, Dengeki SFC, and Howl, there are soundbites from Kitase and producer Kazuhiko Aoki. Kitase recalled, Horii would check the dialogue of NPCs in towns, and just from those revisions alone you could get a strong sense of the Horii style. He'd bring a lot of personality out of the dialogue just by tweaking one or two words. Aoki added, he was really strict with checking the dialogue. He'd tell us, this character would never say a line like that. Which means that Horii also acted as an editor, basically. Now, look, I didn't make this video to dump on the Chrono Trigger Wikipedia article. And chances are by the time you watch this video, it will have become dated thanks to revisions. But there's some other statements we should examine, especially since this would be a primary source for a lot of people, and I have heard these same kinds of putative facts elsewhere. Wikipedia states, Kato and Horii then met several hours per day during the first year of development to write the game's plot, and cites the Chrono Trigger Ultimania guide. When you click on that link, it takes you to the website Chrono Compendium, in which Cal Hampton translates part of a Kato interview thusly. For the first year, I spent hours every week in meetings at Mr. Horii's studio. I had to summarize any suggestions I'd been given or ideas I'd had about quest scenarios. I'd then take the parts that we'd worked on in the meetings back to my own company and think about how to continue those stories. I cross-referenced this translation with the source material included on that webpage and found it to be correct. That's very different from what the Wikipedia article implies. What they're asserting is that Kato and Horii were in an equal writing partnership and toiled together day in and day out, when the reality is that Kato was Horii's clear subordinate and had to run any potential additions or changes by him in a once-weekly meeting. Wikipedia also claims that Kato also devised the system of multiple endings because he could not branch the story out to different paths, but the weekly Famitsu interview translated by the Gaming Intelligence Agency reads, we couldn't include a lot of storyline splits in Chrono Trigger, so we stuck with a multi-ending setup. To be clear, I'm also not here to detract from Masato Kato, but I think it'd be helpful to look at some of Kato's other work when trying to figure out exactly how much he had to do with Chrono Trigger's writing. Kato is credited in some sort of writing, scenario, or screenplay capacity in a number of games, including Xenogears, Sands of Destruction, and the first Baten Kaitos game. But his most notable endeavor, and the one where we pretty much know for a fact that it was mainly his work, is Chrono Cross. I can't find anything anywhere that suggests anyone but Kato was involved with the story, dialogue, or even just the basic blueprint of this one. In interviews, Kato nearly always answers questions about major or minor plot details of Chrono Cross from a position of authority or personal involvement. He never seems to mention anyone in particular from the writing staff, nor be at a loss to explain something that perhaps might have been someone else's creation. It's because of this that I feel confident putting forth Chrono Cross as a reputable snapshot of Kato's writing. Chrono Cross is more or less a full realization of the Satellaview visual novel Radical Dreamers, which functions as a side story to Chrono Trigger. Chrono Cross takes place in the same world as Chrono Trigger, and is set 10 years after the present time of Trigger, though the geography is different because of what is later explained to be tampering with the timelines. Chrono Trigger utilizes a simple representation of time travel, in which actions in one time period affect events in future epochs linearly. The Guardia of 600 AD stops searching for the missing Queen Leene, which causes her descendant Marl to vanish. Chrono, Luca, and Frog then venture forth to rescue Queen Leene, allowing Marl to promptly reappear safe and sound. This understanding of time travel and its ignorance of concepts like the butterfly effect, whether realistic or not, is simple to follow. The player is presented with a dilemma, and they are shown that they can enact sweeping actions and affect the future in predictable ways, setting their expectations for the rest of the game. In Chrono Cross, the player is instead given two timelines to work with that do not directly impact one another, at least in a temporal way. The key differences are results of the split itself, and this more closely resembles the real-world scientific model of time travel. However, Cross does not explain much of its fabric until very late in the game, when the player reaches the Sea of Eden. For the first part of the game, the player is not given any indication as to what their impending or future motivations might be. Sure, there are objectives like collecting scales for Lena's necklace and assisting Kid in stealing the Frozen Flame, but it's not until after the Frozen Flame heist is already underway that there is any hint of why Surge wouldn't simply go back home at the first opportunity. Contrast with Chrono Trigger, where Chrono first goes back in time to attempt a valiant rescue of his new friend, and the party subsequently goes forward in time to escape retribution, at which time they learn of the world's impending apocalypse. This chain of events more logically sets up the characters and the player's motivations by thrusting Chrono and his friends into situations where they have clear goals and reasons for traveling through time that lead them to a startling revelation. Remember what Yuji Horii said about ease of understanding and taking care not to leave anyone behind. Chrono Cross is far from difficult when it comes to figuring out how to progress in the game, but it generally accomplishes this by bottlenecking exploration rather than showing or telling anything concerning plot progression. Take note also of the fact that Chrono Cross allows the player to select from distinct lines of dialogue when Surge is presented with a choice. You don't want to push words into the player's mouth. The existence of Surge himself also runs counter to Horii's MO. The game does allow you to change his name, but the fact remains that he does have a canon name. Chrono is also a name proffered to the player, but being that it's merely a word taken from the title and general concepts of the game, it makes Chrono feel less like someone whose life we're intruding upon, and more like the blank slates of Dragon Quest. Fans even refer to Dragon Quest protagonists by number, which is a similar sort of concept, having player characters embodied only by the context in which they appear, allowing for more fluid player insertion. If it needs to be said, this isn't to make positive or negative judgments on either Chrono Trigger or Chrono Cross, on their own or in comparison to one another. The games are two different things with differing design philosophies, neither being better nor worse on those merits. But that's exactly why I take issue with the claim that Masato Kato wrote most of Chrono Trigger's story. I do believe that he was an integral part of it. I believe what he said when he wrote certain segments all on his own. But Chrono Trigger has Yuji Horii's fingerprints all over it. It's his concepts, his philosophy, and he possessed executive control that he wasn't afraid to exercise. And I believe his direction is why Chrono Trigger is as good as it is.
さてここで坂口さん、堀井さん、青木さん、この3人の方から制作秘話を聞いてみよう。
If I had to use one word to characterize Yuji Horii's games, it's personable. From the beginning, Horii strove to introduce familiar language and affable qualities into his games, even where you might not expect to find them. This evolved into a desire to craft experiences that would not leave any player ever wondering if they'll be able to make progress. And when he and his cohorts conceived Chrono Trigger, his experience enabled the development team to easily color in between his lines and create one of the most celebrated games of all time. It's unfortunate that most of the world did not get to experience many of his works at the time of their arrival, and some of them are still unavailable officially. The ones we did get sometimes did not adhere to his vision, and not having a complete picture of certain others has clouded Horii's apparent impact. God willing, critical reappraisal in the West will one day elevate his status to the level of his contemporaries.